Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Per Capita webinar, our second last for the year of 2021, which in many respects we can't wait to put behind us. I'm coming to you from the lands today of the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and thank them for the custodianship of the land and water on which we live, land which was never ceded. And I know wherever you are, you will join me in paying your respects to the elders of your traditional lands and welcoming any First Nations people with us today. For those of you I haven't met so far, my name's Emma Dawson and I'm Executive Director at Per Capita. We are recording this webinar, and if you would like to participate in the Q&A after we've heard a little bit from Sean today, you can post your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to as many of those as possible later on. But it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Sean Kelly, who is an old friend of Per Capita, was hanging around the traps when we were setting it up many years ago, and has since gone on to a stellar career working in politics and now as one of our country's leading political journalists and commentators. And his recent book, The Game, is what we're here to talk about today. I would love to show you a copy, but my parents dropped in yesterday and my dad took it with him to read before Christmas. And I said, okay, then I've read it twice, so you can take it away. But if you haven't read it already, it is an incredibly timely work, but also one that I think takes an unusual approach to analysing the character and the impact of our current Prime Minister. I'm going to let Sean tell you a little bit about his book and why he wrote it, and then we'll have a chat and some questions at the end. Sean, over to you.
Emma's absolutely right. Thanks very much, everyone, for having me. I do want to talk a little bit about how I came to write this book, which I never expected to write at all. I was approached by the editor of the monthly magazine in 2018, just after Scott Morrison had become Prime Minister. And he said, would you like to write a profile of Scott Morrison? And I said yes, and I took this on. It was the first long profile I'd ever written. And I did what you would expect to do. I read everything that Scott Morrison had ever said in public life. I looked at everything that had been written about him. I then talked to as many people as I could. And then I collated all of that information. I put it into folders on my computer, Mr. Average, religion, Quinella sharks, etc., etc. And after staring at all of these facts for a long time, I was puzzled. And the reason I was puzzled is because when you're trying to think about a politician and the place they hold in public life, their career, what their career means, I guess you're really thinking about two things. You're thinking about what they believe, and you're thinking about what they've done, the major achievements they've had, the things that they have fought for and won. And in Morrison's case, that was a very difficult task because there weren't a lot of clear examples in either of those categories. Over a period of decades, in terms of beliefs, he had said very little. He'd given a strong maiden speech about his faith, and it was clear that his faith was very important to him. But since then, he'd pretty much he denied that it had any effect on his public life, on his politics. In general, he stuck to very broad statements. He didn't say specific sharp things. On the rare occasions that he did, he would tend to contradict himself later. So it was very hard to really draw any clear threads through his public life. And eventually, I had one of those moments that you hope for as a writer, which is the thing that you think is blocking your way turns out to be the thing that you've been looking for all along. And so it turned out, I realised that Scott Morrison's lack of definition was the defining feature of his public life. And that article was published in the monthly under the title, Leave No Trace. Now, when you write a profile of a Prime Minister early in their Prime Ministership, it's quite a terrifying thing because one of two things can happen. People can overtake you and begin to write exactly the things that you've written about the person before your piece is published. And then the second thing that can happen is you can be entirely wrong. Everything you write based on what they've done previously, they can shift. And your profile turns out to be out of date within a week or two of appearing. Luckily for me, Scott Morrison turned out to be a remarkably consistent character. And what that meant was firstly that the profile still makes sense. And secondly, that when I was approached later during Morrison's Prime Ministership to write a book about him, I said no. And I said no for a couple of reasons, but they boiled down to the fact that Scott Morrison, I thought, wasn't that interesting, partly because he hadn't done anything that would shock me after I'd written that profile. He hadn't surprised in any way. And secondly, because he just didn't seem interesting. And I wasn't sure about that. I thought I might have been wrong. So I talked to friends, I talked to acquaintances, people from the Liberal Party, people from the Labor Party, or at least Liberal voters and Labor voters. And the response of all of them was quite similar. It was that they didn't find Scott Morrison that interesting. It wasn't they liked or disliked him. They just couldn't bring themselves to find any interest in the man. And when I thought about it, I thought, this is a strangely interesting fact. There is this bloke who has become Prime Minister in odd circumstances, who's won an election against all the odds that nobody in the country expected him to win. And still, we know so little about him. And more than that, we don't seem to want to know anything more. And so that in a way was the start of the book. I began to ask myself, how was it that Scott Morrison had managed to deflect our attention for so long? What did they say about him and the way he'd conducted himself in public life? And also, what did it say about us, that we didn't seem to be any more interested? We seemed quite content to take the few superficial things we knew about Morrison and leave it at that. Now, as I started to write the book, the thing you realise, and I suppose I knew this from writing the article, is that nobody can avoid leaving traces altogether. So I started the task that I'd begun with the article again. I began to look very closely at everything Morrison had said and done. And because he hadn't achieved very much, he'd done some things, especially in the immigration portfolio, and I write about those in the book. Because he hadn't achieved an enormous amount, it meant examining in detail what he'd said, the contradictions, the gaps, the startling swerves, the patterns in what he'd said. In other words, what I was looking at was the performance that Scott Morrison had put on. Now, the idea that politicians are performers is pretty second nature to us today. It's pretty obvious, but it hasn't always been that way. And I think it's important to remember that, because in some ways that can remind us that it doesn't have to be this way. There are other ways for politics to operate. Now, there was a book published in 1969. It was called The Selling of the President, 1968. It spent 31 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It was written by a young bloke, I think he was 27, 28, called Joe McGinnis. And he had embedded himself in Richard Nixon's advertising campaign for the 1968 election. And writing about just the advertising campaign for a presidential election doesn't seem that interesting to us anymore. But at the time, it was startling in itself. It was fascinating because it was the birth of an entirely new political world. And you can tell that when you look at what people around that time said. And McGinnis quotes Roger Ailes, who, and of course McGinnis didn't know this as he was writing, but Roger Ailes would go on to head up Fox News before facing multiple accusations of sexual harassment. At the time, Ailes was a young man who was remarkably prescient. He said, this, facing television, this is what politicians are going to have to be from now on. They are going to have to be performers forevermore. What matters about politicians now is not who they are, but who they present themselves as being. And so you began to see this takeover of politics by television. Now, a couple of decades later, insiders like Roger Ailes and the people around him, that this wasn't a new insight. They'd all basically accepted that politics was performance. The same went for journalists. You have Joan Didion, a writer who many of you will know, followed the Michael Dukakis campaign in 1988 when he was facing off against Reagan. And she writes about this thing that, again, would seem very commonplace to us today. She writes about Dukakis arriving at an airport, waiting for his plane to be refueled. And while he's waiting, he tosses a baseball around with his staff. And Didion writes, what we had in the tarmac arrival with ball tossing was an understanding, a repeated moment witnessed by many people, all of whom believed it to be a setup, and yet most of whom believed that only an outsider, only someone too naive to know the rules of the game, would so describe it. And so you had this division at that point between insiders and outsiders. And what I think's happened in the decades since is that on some level, we've all become insiders. We all know the rules of the game, or at least think we do. And so once upon a time, you had a candidate like Michael Dukakis throwing a ball around, or before Dukakis, I should say, a candidate throws a ball around, it means something. It means that he's easygoing and ordinary. By now, we all look at that moment and we think it doesn't mean that he's easygoing and ordinary. What it means is he's trying to impress upon us how easygoing and ordinary he is. Now, that's fine. On some level, that means we are more savvy about politics. We understand something that we didn't once understand. And that seems like a good thing. But that understanding that at first we applied to those photo ops, those gimmicky moments, I think we have begun to apply it to everything, including, very importantly, policy. So that very often now policy is analysed by the media and by voters as well in terms of the political intention behind it. And so people don't say, for example, in the last couple of weeks, well, Labor's climate policy will do this or that. To a very large extent, they say Labor's climate policy is designed to not give Scott Morrison ammunition and to not give people to the left of the Labor Party enough ammunition either. And so you could say, you could write similar sentences about the coalition's approach to climate. Things are analysed, very serious policies are analysed to a very large extent through their political implications. In other words, we have begun, I would say we almost entirely now in the public sphere talk about politics as a game. And so you have three elements there. You have politicians who are becoming better and better at the game, better and better at performing. You have journalists who have learned to accept the notion of politics as performance. And you have voters who might be skeptical of the performance on some level, might even complain about it, but have also largely learned to accept that that's the way it is. And I think the more accepting we've all become of that, the more distance has opened up between politics and reality, the more distance has opened up between the performance of politics and the fact that politics actually has consequences for real people and their lives. And that's one of the things I write about in my book. Now, I make the point, and I think it is an important point, that it's possible to be a little bit too high-handed about this. The truth is that politics, in some respects, can be seen as a game. In some ways, it's almost necessary to see it as a game. Firstly, of course, you have the fact that politics has long been viewed as ample grounds for entertainment. Shakespeare, Game of Thrones, yes, we see politics as a contest. But I think the greater reason to ignore the slur that politics is a game is the fact that on some level, an election will always sit at the heart of politics. Now, there are nuances here. Of course, it is possible to influence politics and policies from opposition, as Bill Shorten demonstrated during the last electoral cycle. But it is also reasonable to say that winning an election is the single most important element in politics. And so even the most idealistic politician, there is good reason for them to treat winning an election as an incredibly important thing. And that means viewing politics as a contest. Now, in the book, I quote a brief passage from Lewis Carroll that I'll read. He has two people speaking to each other. "What a useful thing a pocket map is," one remarks. "That's another thing we've learned from your nation," he said, "map making, but we've carried it much further than you. What do you consider the largest map that would be really useful?" "About 6 inches to the mile." "Only 6 inches," he exclaimed. "We very soon got to 6 yards to the mile. Then we tried 100 yards to the mile. And then came the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of a mile to a mile." "Have you used it much?" I asked. "It has never been spread out yet," he said. "The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So we now use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you it does nearly as well." Now, there are games, board games, computer games, which seek to replicate some of the strategic calculations demanded by politics in a simplified fashion. And you could, of course, make games that are a little bit more complex than those games. And you could make games that are a little bit more complex than those games, and so on and so forth, all the way up until you reach the point at which you have politics itself. In other words, the justification for thinking of politics as a game is the fact that politics is only an extreme version of the games that are modeled after it. And it's precisely this extremity, the massive amounts of information involved, the huge numbers of people whose lives are involved, that makes it almost impossible on one level for its practitioners to think of it as anything other than a game. Because to make decisions well, or to really make any decisions at all, you have to find shortcuts through the complexity. Now, once upon a time, I think that shortcut for many people in politics was ideology. Then ideology fell out of fashion in the face of technocracy, in the face of bureaucracy, and after the Cold War. And replacing it, I think, to a very large extent has been winning, has been the notion that politics is there as a game to be won. And it means that for political practitioners, the shortcut that they find through all of that complexity is to try to think, well, what is most likely to help us win the election? And then everything is worked backwards from there. Now, of course, the idea of politics as a game feels wrong to us, and it should feel wrong to us. It feels wrong to us for the obvious reason that a game does not, in most cases, have consequences. We might feel very upset when we lose. We might believe it very strongly as we're playing it, but we know in our hearts that the result doesn't matter. A game is a type of fiction, really, like reading a book or watching a play, where we invest in it. We make ourselves believe it temporarily, but we also know that it will end. Where politics isn't a game is that it doesn't end. It is all-encompassing. It does affect all of our lives. There is no exit from it. And so when we talk about politicians treating politics as a game, it might sound high-minded, but it's not. It's not entirely, because really we're not saying they shouldn't think tactically. We're not saying they shouldn't think strategically. Of course, all of those things are going to happen, and they are going to treat the election as a contest that needs to be won. When we say that politicians treat politics as a game, what we really mean is that they've forgotten all of the ways in which it is not a game. They've forgotten to treat it as though it has consequences at all. Which brings me to Scott Morrison. Now, having said at the outset that I found Scott Morrison not that interesting, I've now found myself in a position where I'm spending my entire life talking about Scott Morrison. And that's all right, because I think there are a couple of ways in which he is interesting, in which he's becoming more and more interesting. Firstly, because I think he did see politics more clearly than most people around him, probably more clearly than anyone in this country. It's hard to appreciate how deliberate his performance has been, how constructed and skilled, until you look at it closely. There are essentially two halves to Scott Morrison's career. There's pre-2015, where he kept himself a blank outline, a blank slate. He didn't answer questions. He basically ensured that people knew very, very little about him. They certainly knew very little about his beliefs. And then in 2015, there's this first hint that he might become Prime Minister. I remember that year writing a column in which I suggested that Malcolm Turnbull was angling to take the Prime Ministership from Tony Abbott, and I got a text from a former Labor colleague in Canberra saying, Turnbull's yesterday's man, it's all about Scott Morrison now. Now, obviously that was wrong, but the point is that there was a real sense in some quarters that Scott Morrison would be the next Prime Minister after Tony Abbott. And in 2015, for the first time, Scott Morrison begins to fill in that outline that is left free of content. He begins to create this character, this very thin, flat character, ScoMo, who cooks curries once a week and likes footy. He has catchphrases. He's readily recognisable. And he gives a speech a couple of years later, and he says, what people want to know about you is what you cook and what you think about the footy. And that's all he's been telling us really for a couple of years. And then as soon as he becomes Prime Minister, that effort, it goes into absolute overdrive. He gives his first television interview, not to Lee Sales, but to a rugby league star. He holds a press conference in that first week. The first week he's Prime Minister, he holds a press conference holding a rugby league ball. And there are a few more examples like that. And what he realised is that, in a way, a politician is a character. I know Emma wants to talk about this a little later, so I won't get into this too much now. But essentially what he realised is that journalists are going to present a very simple picture, and that he had to give them what they needed. And that's exactly what he did. He gave them a simple image, which they then transmitted to people, and the people, the voters, to a very large extent, accepted it. And so you have several levels there. You have the politicians who play this game, who perform, who service up these characters. Then you have the journalists who reject nuance and present us with precisely what the politicians want them to present us with, not all the time, but often enough to be very useful to politicians. And thirdly, crucially, the rest of us, And one of the things my book tries to do is ask what part all of the rest of us play here, because politicians wouldn't act this way if it didn't work. Journalists wouldn't write the types of stories they write, present the types of stories they present on the evening news bulletins, if those weren't the bulletins that did very well in ratings terms. And so a large part of what I try to do in this book is ask how all of us might be complicit in the game that politics has become. Now, Scott Morrison is a very particular type of politician. He's very good at the game. He treats politics as a game. He's an incredibly skilled performer in many ways. But I think this is really important. He's not unique. He just happens to be better at it than many of the politicians around him. I think really he's just an extreme illustration of several important trends that we've seen in politics over the past few decades, and particularly in the past decade. And for that reason, I think it's important to study him and see what he says about the moment in time that we've reached in terms of politics, in terms of journalism, and in terms of this country. And I'm happy to hand it over to you, Emma.
Thank you, Sean, for that very articulate spin through your book and focus on its major points. What you've raised, many things there that I'd like to get into before we throw to the questions from the floor. And particularly, I think this idea, and what struck me while reading your book, was about our complicity in the game, and the way that you do describe, I think, very effectively Morrison as almost the inevitable endpoint of the way that politics has become a game, similarly to the way Trump was the inevitable endpoint of America's politics, and Boris Johnson in a way is an inevitable endpoint in the UK cultural context. But you're not just talking about the complicity of the political class or the media class, you're talking about all of us. And I think that's what's so important in this book. There is a tendency on social media, of course, to say, well, journalists are responsible for this. They are putting everything through this lens. But as you just said at the end there, the lens appeals to people, and the lens is something, or the idea of politics as a game is easily understood because we understand the rules of games. And yet there does seem to be emerging in the community now a kind of awareness, whether we're coming to a point in that cycle where those of us that recognised early on the outsiders perspective, certainly in some of the more engaged, politically engaged, more educated, more affluent electorates, in which people do tend to have the ability to sit back and think about these things, there seems to be becoming a demand now for a return to a focus on policy, on integrity, on governance. How the timing of your book coming out at a time when Morrison's being recognised for being perhaps loose with the truth, this flat character that you identify as being recognised and seen through to some extent. What do you think, how do you see the difference between those of us that are attending this webinar and reading your book and having this conversation, and those voters or those Australians that may not be as aware of this analysis or analytical narrative, but have a pretty strong bullshit meter? How do you think it plays out differently, if at all?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. I think, firstly, you absolutely have to draw a distinction between people who are focused on politics or perhaps are able to focus on politics, and those who don't have space for it in their life, perhaps haven't been brought up with it in a family with a strong focus on politics. And to a very great extent, I think that that people, not just Australians, but very broadly, people enjoy not spending a great deal of time focusing on politics. And I think that tendency is more acute in countries where people are comfortable. Australia is a rich country. It's a peaceful country. It has an incredibly good healthcare system. It's very easy for many Australians to switch off from politics. Not everybody, of course, and I would argue probably not any of us in the medium term with the threats coming down the pipeline. But up until now, at least, I think it's been very possible for many people to switch off, and that is a talking point of politicians, and especially conservative politicians. Malcolm Fraser and Tony Abbott both had variations on the phrase, switching off from getting politics off the front page, replacing it with sport. And Scott Morrison, immediately after the 2019 election, said now people can get back to their lives. They can stop worrying about these things and let us get on with them. And I don't think they would be saying those things if they didn't reflect to some extent the desires of many people. But I do, people are very disillusioned with politics now. We know that. We know there's a lack of trust in our institutions that has really developed in very worrying ways over the last decade or two. I think if you want to view that optimistically, and you can, the flip side of that is there is an awareness there that politics is not as substantive and as full of integrity as it should be. And of course, if there's an awareness of a lack of something, you can also say there's a desire for that thing. There is a desire for integrity. There is a desire for a focus on substance. Now, that desire doesn't automatically translate into paying attention to every policy that a politician puts out. But a politician, I think, who stands up and is very clearly policy focused can still win votes. Can still win votes for that reason, for being policy focused. And I think that is probably one of the reasons that Scott Morrison is facing real trouble right now, because it's one thing to focus on image, and to some extent politicians are going to be forgiven that for exactly what I've been talking about, because people accept, for better or worse, and I'd argue largely for worse, that politics is a performance in a game. So they'll accept that image making to some extent, in the same way that they accept the image making of any celebrity. But it needs to have some weight to it. It needs to have some counterbalance in substance. And I think Scott Morrison's difficulty right now is that he hasn't provided that counterweight. If he had, I think people wouldn't give two hoots about the various flaws in the daggy dad persona. But he needs to provide something else.
Yeah. I'd say, I think in a particularly interesting time, because not only in terms of the publication of the book, but there's a kind of inflection point at which, as you say, Morrison was pretty much an unknown quantity at the last election, won that election against all odds, and then brief honeymoon period, disaster of the bushfires, but then this global pandemic, which has really masked the fact that his government did not have a very strong policy agenda and would otherwise have not had very much to do. But as you say, we're at a point now, I think, not only in the electoral cycle, but it's coincided with us beginning to come out of the acute phase of the pandemic, and really a lot of energy around action on climate change. The fact that this is now an existential threat. You can't fix climate change with a sound bite, and people know that. And so he's coming under more pressure. And one of the things I found interesting in the last few days that I wanted to ask you about was he responds to that pressure. As you say in your book, he responds to pressure by doubling down, usually by repeating the lie or repeating the spin or a distraction, a look over there. And that often masks a conversation about policy. And in the last few days, of course, we've had two big policy announcements from the opposition, climate change last Friday and their skills and education package on Sunday. And we've seen Morrison out talking a lot about Gladys Berejiklian running for Warringah. To what extent do you think that's deliberate, and to what extent do you think it's still working for him?
Look, I don't know about the last few days, and look, full disclosure, I've been quite sick the last few days, so I've not focused quite as heavily. I'm
aware, because I had to step in and write your column for the SMA.
You did. Thank you for doing that.
Not nearly as well, but anyway.
No, not at all. It was great. Look, I suspect the Gladys thing, to be honest, is more driven by trying to get Gladys to run, but I could be wrong. Because in general, I absolutely agree with you. In general, he absolutely looks for the thing to control the media cycle. He is very focused on the day-to-day cycle, or certainly on those big moments. And he's obviously trying a number of different approaches to Labor's climate policy, and none of them are quite landing yet. A real problem for him with the liar tag is not being a liar in itself, but the extent to which it undermines his ability to mount credible scare campaigns. And I think it felt a bit like there was a bit of a collective shrug to all of his scare campaign attempts so far around Labor's climate policy. Now it's early days. There's another 6 months until the election probably, and maybe that's enough time to make one of those campaigns stick. But at the moment, it feels like it's not sticking, and so he is on the hunt. He's on the hunt for the next thing, and he does use the same tactics and strategies every time. I think interestingly, one thing that did work for him recently, briefly, obviously, was the security agreement with the US and the UK and the submarines. And for a week at least, that really made it seem like Morrison was in control of the agenda, like he was thinking in serious policy terms. And, the wheels fell off it in some ways quite quickly. But he might now see, and this wouldn't be a bad thing for the country, he might now see that there is, that one of the best ways of driving the agenda is to announce policy. It can work, and it's something he has studiously avoided for 3 years, but that can actually be a useful political strategy, and it would be great if both sides began to see that as a useful political strategy.
Wouldn't it? As someone that's, as you know, desperate policy wonk, it would make me very, very happy. I think what I want to dig into a little bit more here is whether climate change is going to be that issue on which people won't accept spin over substance anymore, because we're obviously seeing a lot of very climate action minded independents standing in blue ribbon liberal seats. I can never pronounce that. Focusing on climate action and integrity and equality for women, which are, three issues, as I've said many times, that shouldn't be a right-left issue, really. They should be above ideology. Equality for women, integrity in politics, stopping the planet burning. They don't, to me, seem like terribly contentious ideas. I wonder whether this is the point at which we will start to see, because of the demands of quite powerful people. So if we're looking at who's running in these seats, who's behind them, people like Simon Holmes à Court, Zali Steggall, obviously already in Warringah, but Zoe Daniel down here in Goldstein, people with quite a lot of cultural capital, quite a lot of clout politically, access to the media, trying to shift that conversation a little bit around what is a fundamental existential issue. Because I think, I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I think in the past what's happened is a lot of people whose material conditions aren't necessarily that much affected by who wins an election every 3 years have been quite okay to sit back and let the game continue, right? As long as they still have a roof over their heads and their kids are at school, they're not that concerned about a lot of the social policy or economic policy issues that don't materially affect them, and they drive the conversation in our country. Now that class of people has landed on some issues that they feel very strongly can't be papered over anymore and can't be spun out of existence or spun out of being a problem, they want to see policy. I wonder whether, not just for Scott Morrison, but more broadly, the game will not work when people with that kind of cultural capital say this is an issue where we actually want to see some results.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I guess I have two slightly different answers. The first is where I think Morrison's approach to politics as a game has broken down is where physical harm has been involved. So the bushfires, the crisis around sexual violence, and the vaccines mess. When people were actually under threat of harm, or threat of harm was the issue at stake, I think it became harder and harder for the rest of Australia to treat politics as a game. And that also meant that Scott Morrison's approach to politics as a game stopped working. And I think that's interesting in terms of shining a light on what sort of a politician Scott Morrison is. But I think it's also interesting in terms of highlighting the fact that most of the time, most of us are able to treat it that way as well. And it's only in those moments of extremity when people's bodies are at stake, when people's lives are at stake, that we are all reminded that politics is not a game. And so in terms of answering your question, I'm not sure, partly because it depends on how present that threat of harm from climate change is. I don't know how present that is right now. I don't know how present it will be after a cold and wet summer that we seem likely to have. I don't know how present it will be if COVID is still a focus in significant ways. So that's part of the answer, which I know is not that hopeful in terms of focus on climate change. And the second part of the answer, which is slightly hopeful and slightly not hopeful, is I think the main driver of the shift right now has been the global context shift, and that has led to the factors you're talking about in terms of people with cultural and actual capital stepping up to the plate. But I would hesitate to say we're at a place where reality is taking the place of spin. I would say that that we are beginning to tolerate a little less spin, and so you can see, for example, in Labor's policy versus the Liberals' policy right now. I mean, the Liberal approach to climate change right now is awful. There's no plan. The targets are effectively non-existent or meaningless. Labor has a better approach than the Liberals, but you look at the way they're talking about it. This is a moderate approach. It's not a radical approach, and they're right. It is a very moderate approach. It's not a drastic improvement over what we are likely to hit with business as usual policies anyway, which is better than the Liberals' policy, but Liberals' target, but only because the Liberals aren't including what we're already going to hit in their existing targets. So, both major parties are still spinning their policies pretty hard in ways that justify the fact that neither of them are doing as much as we need them to, and as we all need them to. Yep. Now, I think in some odd ways that means the next election is being fought on the vibe of the thing. It's being in some ways Labor is fighting, and it all but says this. Is fighting on the idea that you should choose the party that feels like it really believes in doing something about climate change. That's a strange election we're heading into.
It is the strangest election since the last one, I think. I do want to end up with a key question that's related to that, but I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to go to a couple of questions from our audience, which I think really go to a recognition of your understanding of Morrison and of the political scene and how much time you spent thinking about this. From Roberto Calanzi wants to ask you, how does the Parliamentary Liberal Party view Morrison? Do they see him as boring, dull and safe politically, or do they see him as having more political substance?
Look, that's a good question, and I don't have a very very well-informed view on that. My sense right now would be that they don't view him as having a great deal of substance, and I think you can see that in the ways that he's being hit from both sides right now. The moderates are pushing back on some things because he's not that interested in them, and the Conservatives, the further right parts of the party, are pushing him because they've come to the conclusion that he's not really one of them. And they chose him. Well, they preferred him originally over Turnbull. It's worth remembering, part of the reason the Liberal Party got rid of Turnbull, and especially the right of the party got rid of Turnbull, was they never felt like he was a real Liberal. And Scott Morrison was a better option for them in that sense. He felt like a real Liberal. But 3 years on, I'm not sure that's the case anymore. I'm not sure either the right of the party or the moderates feel that he's a real Liberal because he hasn't really pushed for anything, and there's still no real sense of anything that he would push for. There's the comparison between John Howard and Scott Morrison is drawn quite often, and I think it is an instructive comparison. Both of them conducted politics in fairly similar ways. John Howard was also very good at avoiding questions. He was very good at treating politics as a game with strategy and tactics. But if you go back and you watch the interviews that he gave, and I remember watching them at the time and thinking, here's a slippery guy who has mastered the art of the political interview. You watch them now and they are full of substance. What I mean is in comparison to the interviews that we watch now.
Yep.
And that is because John Howard had an ideological agenda, and I might disagree with 90% of it, but it was an ideological agenda, whereas Scott Morrison doesn't seem to have that agenda. And I think that makes it very difficult for people in his party to really latch onto him. And that probably goes some way to explaining why he's never had a great number of close supporters in the party.
I want to dig into this point because it's something I find really interesting. I've had similar conversations with Catherine Murphy and with Peter Harcher about this idea that Morrison is non-ideological and pragmatic and entirely transactional. And I think that's exactly the way he presents himself, and it's exactly the way he wants to be seen. I have long held the view, though, that he is quietly his ideology is very small government ideology, and that what he is quietly doing is dismantling the machinery of government and outsourcing it to the private sector. That he may not even realise himself that that's an ideology, but that it is his sole pursuit. He doesn't actually want to take on big ideological fights. But if you look at everything he's done, it's about shrinking government smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of its practical outcomes. The old joke, make it small enough just to fit into people's bedrooms. I don't think that's necessarily his particular agenda. But I think under the cover of being I don't really stand for anything, if you look at what's happened to the public service, to the relation to the Federation under his watch, to the capacity for service delivery under his watch. I mean, most of that bushfire money still has not gone out to people that need it. We've done that research ourselves, right? And the just explosion in something that's always been part of politics, which is pork barreling, but the almost, shameless explosion of that what we actually have in charge is the country is the bloke that did an MBA in his 30s and is applying out that kind of highly economic rationalist approach to the entire system of government. And that at a time when we need government to actually stand up, he's not only doing that, but he's quite openly saying he wants government out of the way, which has been a very American thing until now. John Howard didn't used to say government was the problem. He was so, I don't know. I don't know what you think about that, but it's always struck me as interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think there is something to that. I think something you said early on is right in that I don't think he would recognise any of that as ideology or as his ideology, and that is the point of ideology in its purest sense. It's invisible. Yep. It's not a set of 10 points on a card. It's the stuff that guides you in your day-to-day life without you even thinking about it. Yep. And it is true that I agree that it's a mistake to think of Scott Morrison as non-ideological. I think he does have beliefs. That said, I guess I do feel that they're more sensibilities. I mean, I realise this goes to the ideology is invisible point, but I do feel they're more sensibilities than they are beliefs. And I guess my main point there would be, I don't think that he would fight for any of them. So he might deliver some of these things in a kind of very slow fashion if he's in power for a long time. And of course, the longer a prime minister is in power, the more impact they have on the national landscape. But whenever he gets pushed back on anything, he folds. There is nothing I can think of that he's really fought for. And
I agree on that. I think industrial relations is the obvious one on that. They couldn't get what they wanted through, so not only did they walk away, they actually just dumped the whole package. And I wonder whether that was the point at which the business community started to go, okay, we might need to think about whether we can continue this kind of one-sided support of this government. It also goes to a question that what you just said goes to a question that John Thompson's posted, I think, which is, do you think Morrison is intelligent enough to develop this media, this persona, his media or public interaction tactics and strategy, or has he got a Svengali in the background doing it all for him? I think that's relevant to whether he sees what he's doing or, yeah.
No, I think Morrison is smart and savvy, absolutely. No, 100%. I think he has always been good at shaping images and messages. You know, it's a particular type of intelligence. I don't mean that to detract from his other areas of intelligence. I just mean on this particular area, he's very skilled. And no, I mean, he's been doing that since very early on in his career. And it began with a real distrust. Well, it's always been an awareness of the power of journalists. And it started out as a distrust, as a nervousness around journalists, where he wouldn't give them anything. And then he realized that he needed to give them something because somebody was going to tell his story. They were going to tell his story. And so he needed to help them tell that story in the way that he needed them to tell it. But I think he began that, you know, I'm sure there are skilled people in his office, but he began that much earlier in his career. So no, I think Morrison drives an enormous amount of that himself. I think there's too much consistency in his public approach and his public statements about that. If you look at what he did in 2015 and the speech he gives in 2017, then what he did in 2018, and again, what he's doing now in terms of the use of images, to me, it seems so consistent that it has to come from something deep within Morrison.
And I think your book shows that. You know, you even go back to his childhood and how he was, you know, the one to take the phone calls when his dad's constituents would ring up. He's been crafting those messages since a young man. So I tend to agree, and I think your book demonstrates quite powerfully that this is his number one skill set, right? Is the message, is crafting the message. There's a question from David Allen, says, how do we change the rules of the game? Which brings me to something I wanted to ask you about, which is a piece from Ellen Fanning in The Guardian on Sunday. Ellen, of course, being one of the hosts of The Drum on the ABC. And she opens the piece by recounting an on-air conversation she had with a former Liberal state minister in New South Wales, Stephen O'Doherty, who said that the Prime Minister's only job was to win the next election, and that she found that quite shocking. And she calls it the game. She's clearly referring to your book. How have we come to the point where, as journalists and in a political current affairs show, we can get back to the point where we recognise it's not his only job, and actually we should be talking about policy, and we should be covering the campaign in a way that uncovers those issues. Ellen has said, you know, she's going to try to do that more on The Drum and to call that out when that happens. And I've seen her do that. I've seen her do it recently with, I think, Kate Carnell and a couple of other guests. And I think because Morrison's approach to the game is so blatant, it's almost an insult that a lot of journalists now are starting to go, well, hang on, you know, not only does this make us look bad, but we're actually reflecting on just how far this has gone. Are you hopeful that there will be a change in the way that our conversation occurs? Because that has to filter through to all of us. As you say in your book, we're all responsible, but it really starts, doesn't it, with the media coverage of the next election?
Well, I don't know where it starts. I mean, cultural change is a really diffuse, complicated thing. I am hopeful a little bit. I do think the media has shifted recently. I think Macron, in a way, gave them some permission to do that. And then I think Morrison, following those events up with his electric vehicles backflip and his denials that it was a backflip, really shone a spotlight on this habit of his. And I think that has led to less deference from the media. And, you know, there's always some deference towards politicians, and that's understandable. You can't come out of the blocks calling a politician a liar or accusing them of acting cynically. You have to wait and see how they act. But Morrison has developed a pretty clear habit and pattern by now. And I think you're seeing journalists take a different approach. And that means that he won't be the only politician that happens to. You know, they will have to treat Labor the same way, and that approach should spread. And so, in a sense, I guess you hope that Morrison's approach has been the thing that has pulled the elastic so far that it snaps back now. And I don't mean against Morrison, I mean against the approach. And Morrison might well get out ahead of that. Like, he might well realise in the next 5 or 6 months that the approach that he has used so successfully for so long is no longer serving him, and maybe he'll shift, and maybe that will be a good thing for everybody. So I am hopeful. I do think the media started to shift a bit. As for the rest of us, and trying to answer the question, it's very difficult. Other than saying each of us need to engage in politics in a different way. We need to talk about it in a different way. We need to think about it in a different way. We need to educate ourselves more about, I'm not saying everybody needs to be an expert at every policy out there, but if you care about a particular policy area, get to grips with it, and know more than the next person about it. And I guess live one's politics. These things are difficult to do, but so many of us have become so good at looking away from things that trouble us. We need to get better at looking at them again.
Well, on that note, Sean, you've been a spin doctor in a past life. You're a rehabilitated spin doctor. You were very good at it, and you've spent more time thinking about these things, about the way we communicate politics and policy than most. So what advice would you have for a scrappy little think tank like Per Capita that only really wants to talk about policy and get policy communication out there? That's, I'm being slightly facetious there, but how do we break through the game to actually talk about the impact of policies that aren't as in your face as climate change, for example, where there is real contest over things like what's the appropriate level of income support, how do we address the housing crisis, the really challenging policy issues? How do we get those onto the agenda while the game's still underway?
I think they have begun to be pushed onto the agenda in the last couple of years, and no doubt that is in part due to efforts of Per Capita and other institutions. Really, genuinely, it is. It's about, because I think places like Per Capita during the pandemic were saying, well, what actually should we be learning here, and what should we be taking out of this? And I think that those issues have started to infiltrate. And so, to come back to the last question about what can each of us do, I mean, this is how cultural change happens. No one of us makes a massive difference. And this sounds both horribly naive and incredibly optimistic. It does happen through each of us shifting what we talk about, what we focus about. And I think there has been a coincidence in a way of the pandemic, of there being probably a sufficient number of think tanks in Australia, of a slow realisation in the media that they have drifted too far from their original purpose, and all of those things coming together such that I think we are beginning to have a debate about the proper level of income support. I think housing has broken through as an issue, not to the extent that climate change is, absolutely not, and not to the extent that it's going to decide the next election, but I would say it's one of the top 5 or 10 issues in a way that it wasn't 3 years ago. So in a way, I guess I'm saying that the job's done, but actually,
keep going.
I mean, so change is happening. Maybe it will be reversed. Maybe this is a very small, very brief lull on the way to a much greater performativity in our politics and an entirely image-based politics. But maybe we're seeing a shift back, and that would be a good thing.
That would indeed be a good thing. I did say to you before we started that I wanted to talk about a particular aspect of the book that I haven't, because we've been having such an interesting conversation. So before we run out of time, one thing I wanted to flag with our audience, if you haven't read the book, is Sean uses literary critique and character critique to actually get into the character of Scott Morrison, which is, I think, incredibly effective. may well be something we should turn to all public figures, but in this instance, the way that you identify him as a flat character and use the kind of literary techniques to do that. Why did you do that, and why did it seem to you like a good fit for this analysis?
I think if you're looking at the way that politicians perform, you have to analyse them in some other way than simply a political frame, because a political frame relies on policy, really. It relies on analysing what people have done, and Scott Morrison haven't done a lot. But I do think this is more broadly useful, because I think that politicians, and this is true of all celebrities to some extent, I'm not the first person to make this observation, but politicians are, to most of us, characters. You know, what do most of us know about a character in a book or on a TV show? We know what the writers choose to tell us. What do most of us know about a politician? Well, we know what the writers of that show, what the journalists, what the TV journalists have chosen to tell us. And I think Scott Morrison really understood that in a way most politicians don't completely or intuitively grasp. And then obviously Forster had this theory 100 years ago of there being two types of characters in literature: round characters, or real characters who will surprise people, who are nuanced, and flat characters who don't surprise you, who are entirely predictable, who can be summed up in a phrase or two, who have a catchphrase and a repeating visual characteristic by which they can be recognised. And those things are Scott Morrison. Scott Morrison knew at the 2019 election that he didn't have much time to impress himself upon the Australian national consciousness. And so he gave us a flat character. And he wouldn't describe it in those terms, but that is what he did, and that is what he understood. And you know, I think it is a danger if politicians decide that that's all we need. But you know, they might, because the truth is Scott Morrison's ploy worked in 2019. What's one of the interesting things about the 22 election is that in a way we're watching to see whether that that strategy can last longer than the 9 months between the time he became Prime Minister and the 2019 election. You know, whether that flat character fades too much in the following 3 years.
Well, I think as a you know, originally having studied theatre and drama, flat characters tend to be in comedies, in short, sharp comedies, and big, broad brushstrokes. But I've never seen one last through a kind of 5-series arc on a Netflix TV show. So you need usually a bit more roundedness to get through more than a half-hour slapstick show. We'll see. It's interesting to me whether that, you know, comes from Morrison's background as a theatre kid. You know, he seems to have that understanding. And certainly to me as a failed theatre kid, or someone that studied actually the theory of theatre, it really, I connected with that in your book really strongly. But so did many other people who've read it, who've said to me, oh, it was a really clever way to kind of explore who this man is, because it's a tool which not everyone has, is that ability to analyse character. So well done. I think it was terrific. That brings us to the end of our hour, but thank you so much for joining us. And speaking of theatre kids, everyone, our next webinar next week is with Van Badham, who is a fellow former, well, she's still a theatre kid, actually. She made a career out of it. I did not. On her book, Q and On. That's this time next week, next Wednesday. And she's taken a really scary and very brave deep dive into the world of conspiracy theories. And that will be our last event for the year. But thank you so much, Sean. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been a terrific conversation. We've got several people in the chat saying I've enjoyed this so much. It's one of the best webinars I've seen all year. So really interesting conversation. We have recorded it, of course, so it will be available for anyone who wants to recap it, or if you have friends that you think might enjoy it via the Per Capita channels. But again, thank you, Sean. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a great Christmas, and we look forward to seeing you in Melbourne in the new year. Thanks, everyone.